Now let's create new component that represents this item, which shows our label. To do so, firstly, we're gonna open up component timeline item, which stores markup for that element. Here we're going to find markup of that element, which is this anchor tag. Cut it from here and create new component called TimelineHour. And then, as always, let's create new file inside of components folder with the name TimelineHour. Here we're gonna add template tag and paste our components markup. And then let's also add a new empty script tag in here, because we're gonna have to move some variables from timeline item component inside of TimelineHour component. First of all, it is this constant, our link classes. Let's move this one inside of TimelineHour component. And also, since this component will need to accept one prop, which will be a value of an hour, we'll also copy and paste props definition from timeline item component, and then back to timeline item component, and in here we no longer use props constant, so we can remove it from here. And now we're gonna use our new component TimelineHour in this component's markup. So let's import TimelineHour component, and then scroll down to the template area, and to this TimelineHour component we'll need to pass one prop with the name hour. And the value for this prop we're gonna fetch from our property of timeline item object. And of course we'll need to rename the property where we defined it. Let's rename this timeline item on hour. Let's also use proper validation function for this property with the name isHourValid. And luckily we have already defined this function within validators module. So far we haven't used this function anywhere outside of validators.js file, so it is private. But now we'll need to use it in one of our components, so let's export this function and move it up to group it with the rest of public validators. And now let's copy import statement for one of the validation function, paste it inside of TimelineHour component and rename function name. So we are importing isHourValid function and use it to validate our property in this component. And also this property hour, its type should be a number. Let's fix it in here. And then on that place, when we referenced our property by using timeline item object, it will no longer work because we don't have access to timeline item object. So we'll have to reference this our property directly on props object. And since our component scope has been narrowed, we no longer need to be that specific and use this our link classes variable name, since this component has only one element within its markup. And we can assume that these classes will be applied to that element. So let's just go with more straightforward name. Let's call it classes. And on that place inside of template, where we are outputting value of an hour, while converting it to the appropriate format. In order to not pollute our template with logic, we can represent this formatted value by computed property. Let's call it formatted hour. And then inside of script tag, we're gonna declare another constant with the name formatted hour. This constant will be a computed property, so we need to use a special Vue function called computed and pass closure in here. And based on the return value of this closure, we're gonna derive formatted value for the hour. And since we are inside of script tag, we need to reference our prop via props object and eventually return this template string from this closure. And of course, we'll need to import this computed function from the Vue package. Let's scroll up and add appropriate import for this function. And after doing all those changes, let's make sure that nothing was broken. As we can see, all our labels are properly shown. But we're going to make output format more consistent, in a way that hour will always be represented by using 2 digits. So for example, if a particular hour, for example 8 AM, consists of only 1 digit, we're gonna normalize it and add leading 0, so it will show as 08. So let's go back to TimelineHour component and modify computed property a bit. First of all, we're gonna convert hour's value to string by using toString method, and then we will use native string method called partStart. As a first parameter, we will specify desired string length. We'll say that every hour should be represented by using 2 symbols. But if hour will consist of only 1 digit, we will add leading 0, which we can specify as a second argument into this function. And now in the browser we will see that all our labels are displayed by using two symbols, and some hours are shown with leading zeros. In fact, we don't even need to use computed property to format hour, because in this case our property is not really gonna change. So there is no need to keep track of changes within this hour prop. So let's refactor this line to use a simple constant instead of computed property. And finally, we don't need that import of computed function on top. Let's remove it from here. And on the page, everything still looks good. We're going to continue development in the next lesson.